Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the summer season. So tonight, we are honored to have with us award-winning author Carol Anderson. We are celebrating the launch of her new book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. It is published by Bloomsbury Books. It offers a critical look at the Second Amendment and considers how it has been engineered to deny the rights of African Americans since its inception. It is a welcome addition to the library of books that have been emerging that really attempt to grapple with the Second Amendment, and really at a moment when the progressive change sort of appears to be on the horizon. So Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and also author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide, a New York Times bestseller. Also Washington Post Notable Book of 2016 and a National Book Critics Circle Award winner. She is also the author of Eyes Off the Prize, The United Nations and African American Struggle for Human Rights, and also Bourgeois Radicals, the NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation, as well as the book, One Person, One Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Galbraith Award. Actually, this is partly one of the reasons why she is a little late tonight, and she may talk about that in a moment. So joining her in conversation is none other than Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. She is no stranger to City Lights, and we have published her book, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, which of course makes her a most appropriate choice for tonight's event as she has a background in studying the Second Amendment. So we have also featured her in numerous events of her own, in many, many books that over the years we've enjoyed and have featured at the store. She's very much like extended family here at City Lights, so it's really wonderful to have her. She is a lifelong activist, educator, historian, and the author of numerous books, including Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie, Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. Her forthcoming book is called Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. We'll be featuring her in an event of her own here on City Lights Live on August the 24th, so please do join us for that. Roxanne is the recipient of the Cultural Freedom Prize for Lifetime Achievement by the Lannan Foundation, and she makes her home here in San Francisco, land of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know we will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you can purchase books. We'll also be having a Q&A at the end, so please do post your questions in that same chat function. So now it is a great honor and a pleasure to have you both with us, gracing our halls. Carol Anderson, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, welcome to City Lights Live.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you, Professor Anderson, for joining us, and congratulations on this timely, important book. I much admire your Take No Prisoners narrative, albeit the book is grounded in deep research. The book is really a gust of fresh air, shattering the circular, endless arguments about the meaning of the Second Amendment. But you go beyond the Second Amendment to a comprehensive history of anti-Black racism in the United States. Could you share a capsule summary of your thesis?
Thank you so much for this. My thesis is that the Second Amendment isn't, when we're thinking about the Second Amendment, the arguments that we have about whether it's a well-regulated militia or an individual right to bear arms ignores the core of the Second Amendment, which is anti-Blackness, which is the role of anti-Blackness in American society, the definition of Black people as a threat, as a danger that must be controlled, that must be contained, that must be policed heavily in order to protect white settlers, white colonists, the colonials, the white American citizens. And we see this anti-Blackness coursing through from the 17th century, where I begin this research, all the way up through the 21st century, that the legal status of Black people, from enslaved, free Black, denizen, emancipated, freed people, Jim Crow Black to post-civil rights African American does not change the context of the Second Amendment and anti-Blackness. It creates the precarity of Black life in the United States.
So you write that you were led to write the book following the 2016 police traffic stop and murder of Philando Castile in St. Paul, which was being broadcast live on Facebook by his partner in the back seat with her 4-year-old daughter. How did that horrific crime lead you to research and write about the original purpose of the Second Amendment?
So here we have a Black man who is pulled over by the police, and the police ask to see his ID. Philando Castile follows NRA guidelines, alerting the police officer that he has a license to carry weapon in the car. The police officer begins shooting and kills Philando Castile. So you have a Black man killed simply for having a weapon, not for brandishing a gun, not for threatening anybody, but for merely having one. And then there was the virtual silence of the NRA in this killing. The NRA had to be pushed heavily by its Black members to come out with what I call a non-statement statement that, oh, we believe everybody should have the right to bear arms. And we've got to wait till the investigation to figure out. I mean, this is the same NRA, the same Wayne LaPierre, who called federal officers, federal law enforcement, jackbooted government thugs for Ruby Ridge and for Waco. But here with the killing of a Black man, virtual silence. And so journalists began asking, well, don't African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And that, I thought, was a great question. It was one of the rights that I had not explored in my previous research. And so that's what sent me on this hunt.
Well, it certainly reveals the NRA's, the white supremacy that's embedded in that organization. But you observe, and it is so troubling that there's this narrative around the Second Amendment that it is sacrosanct, more important than all other rights put together in the amendments and otherwise. When and how did that narrative emerge?
That narrative really redefines what the militia was. So the militia at that time, when the Second Amendment is coming up, so we get the narrative that the militia is about protecting against foreign invasion and protecting against domestic tyranny. And so it becomes like the bedrock of American democracy. It becomes these yeoman farmers and blacksmiths who take up arms to protect American democracy. No. That is the myth that has really been crafted by the NRA, particularly coming in the 70s and the 80s as they're really gearing up a kind of swaddling this Second Amendment in the flag. What we saw happening in the Second Amendment, in the militia actually, was that in terms of being able to fend off a foreign invasion, they were really unreliable in the war for independence. There were times when they wouldn't show up. There were times when they would take off running. There were times when they just wouldn't fight. The unreliability of the militia led George Washington up the wall. And it had Gouverneur Morris, who out of New York, saying to rely upon the militia to protect against a foreign invasion is like depending upon a broken reed. So they knew that the militia could not do that work. And then there is the domestic tyranny. Well, what you had right before the Constitutional Convention was Shays' Rebellion, where you had white men in an uprising against the Massachusetts government for taxation policies and for the seizure of land for the non-payment of taxes. The militia refused to engage Shays' Rebellion. And in fact, some members of the militia were joining Shays' Rebellion. And so it took rich Boston merchants hiring a mercenary army to put down Shays' Rebellion. So this heroic imagery that we have crafted, this PR advertising campaign about this heroic militia, the heroic Second Amendment, does not match up with what was going on at the time. What the militia was really good at was putting down slave revolts, and really good at it. And that was what had sent the Tremors through Virginia at the ratification convention, because James Madison had placed control of the militia under the federal government. And Madison and Patrick Henry and George Mason were absolutely afraid that because you had those Northerners in the federal government, like from Pennsylvania and from Massachusetts, you couldn't count on them if there was a slave uprising to send the militia in to put down this slave revolt. They demanded protection of the militia in the Constitution. They demanded a Bill of Rights to do that. And they threatened, as they had threatened before with the Constitutional Convention, that if they didn't get what they wanted, they were going to scuttle it. So they were pushing for a new Constitutional Convention that would override the Constitution, and Madison was afraid, hurl the US back to the Articles of Confederation that were unworkable. So they were playing a game of hardball.
Well, on the other hand, the NRA was not all that active from its founding, by former Union soldiers, mainly for sharpshooting after rifle shooting became a Olympic sport. But there is this moment in time, I see it as kind of a chronology from the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision, when everything had been shut down with Jim Crow, and the civil rights movement had this incredible victory after long years, decades of work on that case. And it was like a bomb, to these white supremacists who had not really had to assert themselves that much. They controlled everything. They controlled Congress. They controlled really everything. And so they began reacting in ways that I think my generation was not paying that much attention to, because we were involved in the civil rights movement and the Red Power and the anti-Vietnam War. But suddenly in the 70s, they began producing actions. So the NRA was actually taken over by a white nationalist organization called the Second Amendment Foundation, Harlan Carter. They took it over in 1977. And it seems to me there's a distinct difference since that time in this sanctity, how they have convinced so much of the public. 70% of the public says it is they seem to hold it above any other. They brought it, into that center spot. And this is the same time that this originalism of the Constitution, of course, the original Constitution founded a white republic. Only white men could be citizens. So it's almost a cultish thing, it seems to me, this that we see playing out really in the last 4 years without any nuance whatsoever. So I wonder if you found that, if you found that kind of chronology in your research.
What I found was that historically, the anti-Blackness in American society has created an array of gun control laws that were targeted at African Americans. And that when we get into the 1960s, the late 1960s, You have the Black Panther Party for self-defense emerging in Oakland because of the massive police brutality raining down on the Black community, and that brutality not having any level of accountability in the system. And so the Huey Newton and Bobby Seale decided to form this Black Panther Party and to police the police. They knew what the laws were about the kinds of guns you could carry. They made sure that they were always carrying legal weapons that were licensed. They made sure that they always stayed the appropriate distance away from police officers as they're arresting folk. But the Oakland Police Department did not like it. They did not like the aggressiveness of the Panthers. And so they ran to Don Mulford in the California Assembly and said, you've got to help us. The Black Panthers are a problem. We've got, every time we try to pull them over for something illegal, everything that they're doing is legal. It is legal. How do we make what they are illegal? And so here you have the Republican and you have the NRA working with Don Mulford to draft the Mulford Act. And so we've got this image of the NRA as being anti-gun control, but you do see them engaging in these various moments where gun control is, and particularly when you've got gun control rained down on Black folk as being right there front and center. And Ronald Reagan eagerly signed that bill. And it was designed, as I said, to make what the Panthers were doing to police the police illegal. But what you didn't see was doing anything to make the police stop the brutality raining down on the Black community. And yes, so I don't get into the takeover in Cincinnati of the NRA by the right-wing group that said, hey, you know, you were for the Gun Control Act of 1968. We don't like gun control. And you saw the movement of the NRA from being a sportsman's club for all intents and purposes to being a heavily politicized organization that was defining the Second Amendment as the amendment over everything else, uber alles, and then ranking politicians based on how much they were devoted to the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's a turning point, you know, definitely that is with us now, and they've been highly successful with what we know now to be like 75 million people appearing to totally embrace white nationalism. Well, back in time a bit, when I was a history graduate student in the mid 1960s, the United States history narrative was that there was little slave resistance or revolts or marooning in the United States, as happened regularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. This was, of course, a lie, and most of us graduate students knew it was a lie, even though that's what the textbooks were still claiming. You write extensively. One of my favorite chapters is a chapter on slave resistance, marooning, and outright insurrection, both in the colonies and independent United States. Could you tell some of those stories?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, because what we're dealing with, and we're seeing this pushback right now in terms of the battles over the way that what history is taught. So if what you teach is what I grew up with, is that slavery was a benevolent institution and that the enslaved were absolutely happy to be enslaved. They were blessed to be enslaved. That narrative, and that comes from a scholar named U.B. Phillips, who dominated Southern history with that narrative. And then you had the 70s come in that started breaking open that narrative in the slave revolts, and so part of it for me is thinking through the way that the enslaved were were defined as dangerous, as threats. And so there's this moment where it's the Second Continental Congress, and they're trying to figure out how to fund this war against the British. How are we going to pay for this thing? And so the delegate from Pennsylvania says, well, if we tax every 2.5 million person in the colonies, we will be able to raise enough money to be able to finance an army to take on the British. And the South Carolina delegate was like, hold on a minute. You're counting our property in that 2.5 million. That's our property. We don't count your sheep up north. You don't count our property. To which Benjamin Franklin reared back and said, there's a big difference here. Sheep will never make a revolution. And that revolution was what was coursing through, because you had a series of revolts in the 1600s and in the 1700s. One of the largest revolts in colonial North America was at Stono in 1739 in South Carolina. Here there was a labor gang of enslaved men who were building roads near the Stono River. And they're looking, and they're out there every day working, and they're paying attention, they're surveilling, they're figuring out what is the rotation of the guards, how many folks are here, where are the weapons kept. And so on a Sunday, they attacked. They went to where the weapons were stored, killed the two men who were guarding the weapons, and then grabbed that cache of weapons and started taking off, headed to Spanish Florida, because Spanish Florida had, if you come here, there is no slavery. So these folks are headed to freedom. In the process, they make it clear that they are willing to die and they are willing to kill for freedom. As the Stono Rebellion is moving south, the alarms begin to ring massively. And the laws say that every white man must have a gun. And so in church on Sunday, white men heard the alarm, they grabbed their guns and started running after, chasing those in the Stono Rebellion. It took over a year for a mop-up operation. They got most of them. And what you saw in this rebellion was the kind of torture and mutilation to send the signal to the enslaved. This is the consequence for challenging slavery. This is the consequence for believing that you are free. And so they were beheaded, they were gutted, disemboweled, their heads put on pikes, they were burned, they were tortured, all of that to send the signal. One of the things that continued to happen after these uprisings was that you saw that the laws got tighter and tighter about identifying who the enslaved were and what they could do. After Stono in South Carolina in 1740, they passed a law saying that any enslaved person caught trying to head off to Spanish Florida could be scalped. And then the other law from 1740 was the Negro Act of 1740 that defined African descended peoples as absolute slaves, now and those yet to be born. And it then laid out that the things that they could not do, they could not have freedom of movement, they could not read, they could not have literacy, and they could not have access to arms. So this was the way to define them as property, but also to define them as criminal. That's in the law. And to say that they need to be subjugated totally, completely, and fully. And that is the fear that is coursing through this community about having this enslaved Black population. But let me also be clear, it wasn't just the enslaved that they feared. It was also free Blacks that they feared. And as Roxanne has laid out, they also feared the indigenous people. And the role of the militia was to deal with that fear.
Yeah, and the Marooning with the Tuscaroras and the Great Dismal Swamp, and this was also a site of of escape where they developed communities and survived and had children and grandchildren and intermarried. And the same with the Seminoles in the Everglades, which was actually a collection of many, many different remnants of tribes that had fought and lost, and then the fighters went into the Everglades. And so, and then the swamps of Louisiana, Walter Johnson really has an amazing description of literally a civilization that developed, and the Marooning right there where all the plantations were, but they couldn't take horses in there. They couldn't get in there and they didn't know the place. Yeah, I really love these stories because they're they're models, of revolution and resistance that don't appear in our narratives of history, that we have something to look to that we like about this country. There's not that much. You do point out that the slave patrols have been created in the late 1600s, brought by slavers from Barbados who founded the South Carolina colony. These were brutal enslavement practices, and the slave patrols were, this model spread all over and became the institution, that was a part of the provision of the Second Amendment. They were the citizens' militias, of course, already existed for taking native land, burning their villages, their crops, and driving them out. So at first they carved out these slave patrols out of the militias, but these white settler militia members, many of them were landless or land poor, and often could not afford to be slavers themselves, although they wanted to be. And they actually balked at the task to police enslaved people for the rich slavers. So they had to, when they took native land, when they did that, they had the reward of the land, but they had no benefits from serving the slavers. So I see this process of adapting these white settlers to being slave patrols as the sort of beginning of the merger, the erasure of class among white men, where they were then participants in slavery, even though many of them never would come to own slaves themselves. So I wondered if you could say how you see the Second Amendment. You think it may be more of a codification of an already existing institution rather than something really new at the Constitutional Convention? And how do you see that relationship of anti-Black racism in the context of settler colonialism?
Great questions. I see the Second Amendment as the embodiment of the fear of an enslaved revolt. And this is what Patrick Henry and George Mason were hollering about with James Madison at the Ratification Convention in Virginia, that they were afraid that the militia would not come to their rescue and that they would be left, as George Mason said, defenseless. And Patrick Henry was like, the North detests slavery. That they are going to try to take, as he said, your inwards away from you. And they saw what they wanted was to ensure that they would be consistently protected from enslaving people, from the quest for freedom that these Black people had, from what the free Blacks, they were afraid that free Blacks would help incite the enslaved, that they would provide models and leaders for the revolution. And so they wanted all of that clamped down. So I see this as an embodiment of what had been going on after the uprisings in Virginia in the 1600s, after the uprisings in South Carolina in the 1700s. This was the embodiment of that. This was also the embodiment of the lack of trust that they had, because during the War for Independence, not enough white men were willing to join the Continental Army. And so it got to the point as the British were hitting the South, you know, they just took over Georgia like that. As they're coming to hit South Carolina, George Washington's emissary, John Lawrence, comes and says, look, you don't have enough white men to take on what the British are bringing. You have to arm the enslaved. The South Carolina government was horrified. They said they were alarmed. And they said that, you know, that it made them wonder whether this was a nation worth fighting for, and that they would rather take their chances with the British than arm the enslaved. That fear of arming the enslaved and what that meant also came through in the ratification convention, where Patrick Henry's like, and you remember that they were trying to arm our slaves against us. Remember that. Don't forget it. And pushing James Madison to protect them. How that fits with settler colonialism is that, you know, that what this means is that you've got these militia who are armed, well armed, and that they are claiming this land for themselves and removing the indigenous people from that land and giving it the aura of we are bringing civilization, as if civilization wasn't already here, in terms of making it legitimate, this process of control and domination of people who are not white. That's what you see emanating out of this Second Amendment.
You know, I wonder what you think, if you think there's a relationship between slave patrols and policing today. It seems that fear and that absolute sense of control, and just the image of a Black man running and getting shot in the back. And often these policemen say things like, I don't know why I did that, or I didn't mean to do that, or I thought it was my taser. But it's almost like it's in their DNA. And I'm just wondering if you think that there's a lineage of the slave patrols. I know Mumia Abdul-Jabbar wrote a little pamphlet on this that was very convincing argument. But I think in your book, you kind of separate the formation of police from the slave patrols.
And so what I see, though, is the through line of anti-Blackness and defining African Americans as dangerous, as threatening. And so I juxtapose, for instance, the treatment of Kyle Rittenhouse, who was the 17-year-old white teenager who had an illegally acquired AR-15, crosses state lines, goes to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the police welcome him, offering him water, saying, we really appreciate that you're here, in the middle of a mass protest against the shooting of a Black man, Jacob Blake, 7 times in the back. That's what was happening in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And you have Kyle Rittenhouse crossing state lines to protect property, he said. And the police welcoming him. They don't see him as a threat. Instead, they said, we really appreciate that you guys are here. He then goes and he guns down 3 people, killing 2 and seriously wounding a 3rd. He walks towards the police with his hands up as if to surrender, and they just go right by him. They don't see this white 17-year-old carrying an AR-15 as a threat. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, Ohio, you have 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who is playing in a park by himself in an open carry state with a toy gun. And granted, the gun didn't have the orange tip on it that says, "Hi, I'm a toy," but Ohio is an open carry state. And as long as you're not pointing the gun at anybody, you're fine. You're not a threat. The pavilion, the park was empty. He was not a threat. The police rolled up, and within 2 seconds, they shot him. And what they said was, he was a threat. He was dangerous. We were fearful. That's the language that we hear over and over. He was dangerous. We were threatened. We were fearful. I mean, so this is what you hear with Eric Garner. This is what you hear with George Floyd. This is what you hear with Walter Scott. This is what you hear. This is what you hear. This is what you hear. So the way that the anti-Blackness of threat, danger operates is that it puts the precarity of Black life front and center, so that there's no place that you can be where this hyper policing does not put your life on the line. You're in your car, you can get got. You are walking in the park, you can get got. You are in your home, you are not safe. Think about Breonna Taylor. So this is what that kind of precarity as danger, threat means with the policing and with citizens. So think about Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old who was just walking to a convenience store and had Skittles and iced tea. And George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watch captain, sees him and starts going, "Oh, this guy looks really suspicious. There's something going on," and they always get away. And he gets out of his car with a loaded Glock, loaded 9mm to stalk this child through that community. And he kills Trayvon. But the narrative becomes Trayvon was a thug. He was big. He was Black. He was a criminal. He was a drug smoking, a hoodie wearing, grilled up thug. And poor George had nothing else that he could do but to defend himself because Trayvon was the threat. How does an unarmed teenager become the threat when stalked by a man who has a loaded gun? Anti-Blackness. And Zimmerman walked.
Yeah, and he walked under the stand your ground, right?
Yes. So his defense didn't use stand your ground, but the police investigation was predicated on stand your ground, and the judge's instructions to the jury were predicated on stand your ground. And what we know about stand your ground is that it expands the castle doctrine. And the castle doctrine says if somebody comes into your home, you have the right to defend yourself. But stand your ground says anywhere that you have a right to be. And if you perceive a threat, you can defend yourself. When Black is the default threat in American society, it means that Black people can easily be gunned down and it be found justifiable homicide. The data are clear. Whites who kill Blacks are 10 times more likely to have it ruled as justifiable homicide than Blacks who kill whites using stand your ground. Whites who kill Blacks have a 281% likelihood of being found justifiable homicide than whites who kill whites. Having Blacks as the victim makes the threat of stand your ground much more plausible in a defense.
True. Well, in a minute, I want to ask you to, if you'll read a short passage. We're getting a little close to Q&A, but I wanted to ask you about this. You write that the Second Amendment is so inherently structurally flawed, so based on Black exclusion and debasement, that unlike the other amendments, it can never be a pathway to civil and human rights for 47.5 million African Americans. And you, in the book, the last words of your book, you write, "The second is lethal, steeped in anti-Blackness. It is a loaded weapon lying around, just waiting for the hand of some authority to put it to use. So I think your book is an amazing vehicle for raising consciousness and hopefully outrage. But are there also concrete steps that can be taken that can delegitimize the Second Amendment and actually maybe get rid of it?
Well, so one of the things that I talk about in here is that knowing the history of the Second Amendment, not this mythology that the NRA has crafted, but its actual history, will be important to put the Second Amendment on the same plane as the Three-Fifths Clause in terms of its inhumanity, in terms of the way that it is about the debasement of Black people and the destruction of Black people's rights. Once we remove the Second Amendment from its venerated, hallowed ground, we can begin to have a real conversation about the role of guns and violence and what real security looks like in the United States, what real safety looks like in the United States. One of the things that I just recently argued in a op-ed in The Guardian was that we have these twin pandemics hitting. We have the twin pandemic of mass shootings and the pandemic of anti-Blackness. And it is that anti-Blackness, I'm arguing, that is key in understanding why, for instance, after Sandy Hook, why we didn't get any real movement. And that, I argue, is because we've got this narrative about Black danger, Blacks as dangerous, and Blacks coming to get whites, and that their guns are the only line of safety between them and this Black horde coming through. You hear that when Charlton Heston is holding up the gun saying, "From my cold, dead hands," and he's talking about, heaven forbid, if you are, a white male, because basically it was like, this society is against you. You hear it when Lauren Boebert out of Colorado is talking about, if we defund the police and without our guns, we are going to be left defenseless against the thugs, against the drug dealers, against the gangbangers, all of which are synonyms used to define African Americans. And Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying for Whiteness, where he talks about families who have endured gun violence. When it comes to talking about, gun safety laws, they are absolutely opposed, because what they say is that if you take our guns, we will be left defenseless against those hordes coming in from St. Louis who will try to take everything that we have. So that anti-Blackness, that fear of Black people, is what keeps short-circuiting even having real conversations about gun safety laws, about what these mass shootings are driving, and how we can begin to have real safety in the US. So right now, what we're willing to do is we're willing to be afraid in our schools. We're willing to be afraid where we work. We're willing to be afraid at the grocery store, in church, in order to have some level, what we think of as safety against the dangerous Black population.
Well, now can we get you to read a little bit? I love your writing. Like I said, it's take no prisoners. It's very, very vivid writing. So I want people to hear a little bit of it from you.
Thank you. And I'm going to just read a very short passage.
Okay. Yeah. So we can go to Q&A.
Yes. So this is after the Civil War, and it is after there has been the Colfax Massacre and then the Hamburg Massacre, 1873 and 1874. When word of the massacre reached President Grant, rage and sadness combined, because he realized something horrible, truly horrible. Hamburg, as cruel, bloodthirsty, wanton, unprovoked, and as uncalled for as it was, he said, is only a repetition of Mississippi, Louisiana, and all these southern states. The common thread among them, Grant solemnly acknowledged, was not civilization, not Christianity, but, quote, the right to kill Negroes without fear of punishment and without loss of caste or reputation, unquote. Simply the right to kill Black people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the book, and thank you for joining us tonight. Peter, are you going to field some questions?
Yeah, and we do have some. So Janet asks, would you talk about the chronology of Black and Indigenous women being able to own guns? What the circumstances were that gave them that right, and what unique challenges they have faced around this? And perhaps start with when white women were given the right to own guns.
You know, that's a great question. And I got to tell you, I don't know specifically. What I have seen in the laws have been the banning of Blacks and what they say, Indians from being able to own weapons. And I saw that after the Civil War, Black women had guns. During the Civil War, Harriet Tubman had her gun. And yes, but what we also saw was that when Black people had guns, as did when Indigenous people had their guns, they were a threat. And that threat meant that they could be killed by overwhelming state power. And so you have the laws saying they shall not, they shall not, they shall not. And when they did, because of for protection, for self-defense, you had overwhelming state power coming down to kill them. And so this is why you even have today the language of say her name, which deals with Black women who are killed by police, some of whom had weapons, some of whom were unarmed, but were seen as a threat, and therefore their lives were expendable.
We have another comment by Ree Ellis. Will any law help because white militia then and now just hate? It's not in their plan to respect.
You know, and I think one of the things we need to do is to understand the asymmetry in power. The white militia, so the white militia in the South, they were not overwhelmingly in terms of numbers. And they were being held back, sometimes in check, by Black soldiers after the Civil War. But Andrew Johnson, as the president, removed Black soldiers from the South. It requires that you have an engaged citizenry that delegitimizes the kind of white domestic terrorism that these folks bring. Right now, they're being swaddled in the flag. They're being told they're patriotic citizens. They're being told that they are the standard bearers of the founding fathers. They don't know how close that is. They're being told that what they are doing is on the side of justice and what is right. It requires a society that delegitimizes domestic terrorism and the kind of violence that they bring in order to extract that power that they currently have. And that means that we have to, and I gotta say this, we've got to be able to mobilize, to vote, to get people in power who will not hold up this kind of terrorism as being legitimate, but in fact treat it as the illegitimate, illegal activity that it is. And it requires that we are very conscious, and we're putting pressure on social media, on these big tech companies in terms of the algorithms that they're using that heighten right-wing violence.
Timothy asks, you had used the word denizen in your talk. Is there a significance to this word?
Yes. Denizen is that what free Blacks in the North had after the founding of the US. Denizen is that halfway land between being enslaved and being a citizen. And so, and it became codified that they weren't enslaved, but they weren't free people like free whites were. So they didn't have the full array of rights. They couldn't, for instance, easily cross state lines. They couldn't bear arms. Many could not vote. And so their freedom was a very tenuous thing. And you see how tenuous it was with the 1857 Dred Scott decision that says that Black people have never been and never will be citizens of the United States. And they have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And that really encapsulated denizens.
N asks, prohibitions are rarely, basically never enforced equally across lines of marginality. This is particularly the case when the police who enforce such laws, stop and frisk comes to mind. As such, I find myself disenchanted with laws to use demand consumption side methods to control guns. How might we control this in other ways?
You know, we have and Roxanne helped me with this number, over 300 million guns in the United States right now. So we have more guns than we have people. We've got a smaller number of people owning just tons of guns. It almost sounds like a bad rock group, doesn't it? And again, I really believe that so much is about cultural messaging, about the ways that guns now have, and I mean, Roxanne's book, Loaded, is just brilliant as it's talking about how it becomes the embodiment of the hunter, of this Americanness. And it's a way that has to be able to decouple Americanness and from the gun. And that is a strong cultural message. When you think about the ways that the cultural messages got us here, how the movies, how the novels, in fact, heralded the gun as the thing that made you just virulent, that made you strong, that made you independent, that made you human, that made you a citizen, that made you worthy. How those cultural messages embodied that, then there needs to be another set of cultural messages that are equally strong and pervasive, that begin to explain the dangers of this. And one of the things I'm very clear on in this book is that this isn't an anti-gun or a pro-gun book. This book is really about African Americans' rights.
So I regret to say, we have run out of time, but thank you both so much for this great gift. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Roxanne. Please be safe, be well. We hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.